Hi, Abby. It's really good to see you. I feel like it's been a while since we saw each other in person, but from my perspective, I feel like I see you on a weekly basis because of your YouTube channel. So, welcome to our podcast, and I'd love for you to introduce yourself so I don't have to make up other things. So, today's conversation will be around careers. So, it's going to be a career talk theme, and we'll be talking more about the transition that interviews are having with the COVID times, and more like virtual interviews versus in-person interviews. But before we get to that, let us know who you are and why you are an expert on this topic.
Great. Thanks so much for having me, Natalie. I'm excited to be doing this podcast and YouTube video with you. So, I am um, coming from Life Work Balance, which is my own personal business where I do career coaching and consulting. However, my background is in counseling. So, I have my master's degree in clinical mental health counseling, and that's actually how I met you. So, I was completing my internship for my specialization in career counseling at Metropolitan State University, which is how our relationship began. And once I graduated, I realized that although I loved the career counseling side of things, the career coaching was truly where my passion lies. So I started Life Work Balance shortly after I graduated. That was back in January of 2018. And now, about 2.5 years later, I decided to start my own YouTube channel because it was a way for me to reach more people with the same content. So I found that a lot of people struggle with writing their resumes, with applying to jobs, knowing what type of resume to use versus do they need a cover letter. So I've been able to kind of come up with some content that can help people quickly go through that content and realize what they need to include if they don't have time to meet with a career coach or may not have the money or the finances to meet with a career
Mhm.
coach.
That's
Yeah.
excellent. And it's really good to hear that people are so passionate about supporting, the young professionals, career changers, students, that we put in this time to kind of create additional resources for them, because you're absolutely right. A lot of the information is inaccessible or hidden, and I think making it more public and accessible is so beneficial to a lot of people. And when you started your YouTube channel, can you share with us sort of your journey through this? Like, was it something that you knew exactly you want to do YouTube, or did you start in any other way?
Yeah, so it was actually one of those things where I thought about it for several years and never pulled the trigger on it. So I
Mhm.
kept, kind of in that analysis paralysis. I wanted it to be perfect. And I realized that there was no such thing. So I just decided,
Yeah.
what the heck? I'm going to put some content out, see how it goes. The pandemic had recently started here in the United States. So I was working from home full time. So I had a little bit of extra time on my hands because I wasn't commuting as much.
Yep.
So with that extra time, I figured, you know what? I think I can go ahead and start making these videos. And
Yeah.
it was scary, and it still kind of is. I feel like I'm getting a little bit more used to it because it's been a couple of months of making videos every week, but it was intimidating. I felt like
Mhm.
I didn't have the right equipment. I felt like I didn't have enough content. So I going to my place of that analysis, instead of getting paralyzed there, I was able to be a little bit more proactive. And I created a content calendar. So I have a list of everything that I would like to
Mhm.
record over, each week for, I believe I have about the rest of the year planned out with my
Mhm.
content. That way
Nice.
it's not too overwhelming.
hmm And when you think about, starting something new, how many ideas and projects that are good stop at that level of being kind of afraid of something new or something different? And I'm there with you because I've been exploring the idea of starting a blog or a YouTube channel or a podcast for students for now a long time. And I feel like, with all the negative things that happened during the COVID year, I think this is one of those positive things that I finally pulled the trigger and I'm doing it. And I think of myself as this person that needs to really analyze and think about it for a long time before I do it because it has to be perfect. No, it doesn't have to be perfect. So I'm so glad that we are talking about this because this relates to any aspect of our life, whether it's the project in school, something that you're working on at work and you're like, oh, but it needs to be perfect, or something like this, like a hobby or maybe something that you're passionate about. And I think it relates to a lot of conversations I'm actually having with students that they're so afraid and they don't have all the things needed. I don't have a big team auditing these audio files and video files, but it's okay. It's going to be a fun learning curve, and that's what's important. We're on this lifelong journey of learning, I suppose. So it's good that we're doing this.
Yes.
And when you think about, all the things that are happening actually this year, a lot of changes, right? Students are going remote to remote learning. Professors are going to remote teaching. We are changing the way we're hiring people. We're changing the ways we're onboarding new staff, right? New employees. I'm guessing the same is happening to the interview process, right?
Yes.
And I think for this episode, I'd like for us to focus more on that. First, because I always have students who are graduating, I always have folks who are applying for jobs. And are we prepared for this virtual experience? I feel like not so much. So,
Right.
what would you have to share on this topic?
Yeah. So first, I want to go back to something that you mentioned about how that fear that kind of paralyzes us from actually taking action relates to something in every aspect of our life. And I think it in particular relates to our careers. So whenever we're first graduating from college and we're applying to those first few jobs, it's hard to actually accept the fact that I might be good enough for a job that pays a little bit more or has certain perks. So it's being able to be confident in yourself and take that leap of faith to apply for those jobs, which then leads us into this conversation about interviewing. So when it comes to interviewing, there's differences, but also a lot of similarities when we interview virtually and in person. And I think the primary difference is in the logistics of how you prepare for the interview. When it comes to virtual interviews, there's a lot of other things you have to think about that you don't think about with in person interviews. So, for example, the equipment involved. That's something that employers have to consider for potential interview candidates, depending on the level of job. So, if it's a very entry level job where people who may not have a lot of education or experience coming into it, they may not have the equipment available to successfully interview. They may
Mhm.
not have a computer. They may not have a cell phone that has a high quality video camera or microphone on it.
Yeah.
They may not have the resources to purchase an external camera or an external microphone. So that's something that employers have to consider. But from the interviewee perspective, we also have to consider what that experience is going to be for the interviewer on the other end of that camera.
Hmm.
So we have to focus on how we're going to sound, how we're going to appear on camera. I've seen a couple of YouTubers actually give advice about saying do not use your cell phone for a video interview. And I actually don't agree with that. I think that our cell phones these days have better cameras than a lot of our other built-in
Computers.
cameras that we might have. So for
Hmm.
example, with my YouTube channel, I actually use my cell phone to record rather than my computer because it has 4K high definition recording available on it.
Yeah.
Um, when it comes to the microphone and the speakers, we have to be aware of what that sounds like. So, like right now, you and I each have headphones in, but we're using an external microphone. And that's because we get that feedback sometimes where the microphone will actually pick up what's coming through the speakers. So, there's lots of logistics we have to consider, especially with our equipment. And with an in person
Hmm.
interview, you don't have to consider any of those things.
Yeah. And when you think about, you know, I don't know, I just feel a little skeptical that virtual interviews might not be the best way to interview for all types of individuals. Like, for example, for me, I feel like whenever well, okay, I'm gonna go back and say, virtual interview is definitely better than phone interview, in my opinion.
Yes, I would
Because,
agree.
yeah, at least, I can see people, I can use my hands, verbal, nonverbal communication, which I think is important. But still, I feel kind of bounded by this virtual world, not being able to connect fully with the room full of people who are interviewing me. And so,
Yeah.
I don't know, like, do you have any recommendations for folks to prepare in that regard? Maybe standing, sitting, like even physical, like what do you think about that?
Yes. So first you want to make sure that you're in a spot where you're comfortable so that you don't feel extra nervous and anxiety when it comes to the interviewing process.
Hmm.
So find a quiet space where you're not going to have other people or pets interrupting you. That way, you're sure that the experience that you're going to be having in your room is
Hmm.
going to be calm and that it's not going to be distracting for the interviewers on the other side. Then you also want to really focus on having eye contact with the camera. So that makes it a little bit more realistic when it
Hmm.
comes to how you're speaking to the people on the other side of the camera. I recommend actually putting a sticky note on top of your picture in the video interview so that you're not looking at yourself because it's so easy to, have your eyes go to where you are. And then
It's
also
very
put a sticky note at the
distracting.
camera. It
Yeah.
is. Well, and
Hmm.
we're not used to seeing ourselves all the time. When we're in an in-person interview, it's not like we have a mirror in front of us where
Hmm.
we can look at ourselves the whole time.
Remember, put a sticky note on your face, like I'm looking at myself right now. It's just very distracting.
Yes. Well, and even if I'm looking at you, it's not the same as looking at the camera and making that eye contact. So it doesn't feel as personal.
Yeah.
So I'm trying really hard to make sure that I'm looking at the camera when I'm talking to you rather than looking at you, even though that's
Interesting.
more of the natural tendency as I would rather look at you than the camera, but it feels more natural to you probably for me to be looking at you through the camera than at your picture on the screen.
Right.
So I
Because right now, and honestly, let's talk about this, right? Logistically speaking, you're looking at the camera, but I feel like you're looking like right. Yeah, it's just interesting. But then on your end, I am looking at your picture, so I'm more like this, right? My
yeah.
eyes are looking down sort of instead of straight ahead at you.
And
Huh.
because I'm still looking at the camera, I don't see that you're looking at me. So it's
Hmm.
a very odd experience. But from an interviewee perspective, to make it feel more realistic and genuine to the interviewer, which is something that we as interviewees have to try to do to show up as our best potential selves for this job, we want to make eye contact with the camera. We want to have our cameras elevated so that it is more at eye level. So if I were to be, you know, looking down at my camera, that's a completely different view than having my camera at eye level.
Yeah.
And the same thing if you have your camera above you and you're looking up at it. So
Hmm.
there's some logistical things there where you want to make it as close to an in-person experience as possible, but we as interviewees are responsible for creating that on our end.
Hmm.
So the same thing comes with that body language and smiling and trying to be yourself, which is really hard to do when you're in a room by yourself and you're interacting with a screen.
Yes. And another interesting piece I noticed with the remote teaching and learning, this semester I'm teaching a first year seminar class, and those students that do have their webcams, for example, their webcam could be somewhere here, and I'm just looking at the side of them, or they could be in a very dark room and I can't even see their face.
Yes.
So, just trying to avoid those situations when you're interviewing. Think about that ahead of time.
Yes.
One thing that you mentioned earlier is try to make sure you are in a room that provides that privacy without pets. Well, I'm surprised my cats are not just jumping all around here. And sometimes it's challenging to really isolate yourself with the reality of your household. So, do you feel like employers would count that against you? I don't know. Like
No.
we're trying. Yeah.
Definitely not. So if I'm ever in, so I not only have my personal business life work balance, but I also work for a local government here in Colorado. And so I'm on their talent management team. And in fact, just was finishing up interviews virtually for a position last week. And so one of the things that we do from an employer perspective is when we reach out to our candidates, we let them know that we understand that we are all in this virtual environment. We are all probably at home. We are all going to probably have distractions of some sort. So we're just going to do our best to manage it, but that we're not going to, dock any points if,
Hmm.
your cat jumps on your lap and you can see a
Hmm.
tail kind of in your face or a
Yeah.
dog barks in the background.
Yeah. Okay, that's good to know because I have a lot of students actually in a position where they're all at home and their children don't have daycare or school and they're all at home and they're trying to be in a quiet space, but somebody is out there in the living room. And I just want to kind of talk about this to eliminate that anxiety that if something like that happens, obviously you will not be just not considered because of that. Yeah.
Right, right. And I think that we as interviewees have to do our best to try to manage that. So if I do know that I have an interview coming up and I am a single parent and my 3-year-old is going to be running rampant in the house, that's probably not the safest for my 3-year-old. And I'll probably be high strung the whole time during the
Yeah.
interview, wondering what they're up to. So if I know that I have an interview coming up, maybe I can be a little bit more forward thinking and reach out to a friend or a family member or a neighbor who might be able to just stop by for the 30 minutes that I'll be
Hmm.
interviewing and watch my child or take them outside or take them to a park, which again is kind of iffy right now with the pandemic. But if there's someone that we trust who can
Hmm.
cover, even with a dog, take my dog on a walk so that they don't go
Hmm.
barking, at the mailman
Hmm.
as he walks by. If we can be a
Absolutely.
little bit more proactive about that, then we can reduce our own anxiety, which helps us show up as more authentic and genuine during this video interview.
That's very true. So let's do our best to prepare and think about those different pieces that come into virtual interviewing. And when you think about, let's say, so what I was thinking about earlier is one of my friends, she was actually going through a pretty extensive 3-round interview for a position. And the first one was a very just a phone call like screening. And I'm used to those and I know like, yeah, sure, phone call. Then the second round was like a committee meeting and they were asking her questions. The third one was like 4 parts with a presentation that she had to make and even engage people. So again, it depends on what type of positions you're applying for. It might not be just you answering questions. It could be anywhere from a simple, let's answer the questions, to a full blown presentation, to answering technical questions that some engineers do. Um,
Exactly.
yeah, I
Exactly.
just,
Well, and there are different types of video interviews. So, very
mhm,
large organizations like Amazon, for example, they use video or virtual interviewing, but it
mhm.
is through a software system where you're not actually interacting with people. So,
Oh,
you
wow.
log in and you have 3 to 5 minutes to record your answers to questions. And then those answers get sent to someone to review. So, there are different ways to do video interviews and that I've never done an interview like that, and that would be very different. And
I did.
luckily you've done that one before?
I did twice.
Oh my
And
gosh.
both times, I know, both times I was qualified for the job. But because I don't have this skill of sort of like selling myself, and it was the same way, it was like Zoom. So I see myself, and then it says,
Mhm.
when you're ready, start recording. And I do that and I talk to myself. And no matter how many times I practiced doing sample and questions, it was still very odd. That's just to say that it's not an easy process. We all need to practice. We all need to have career coaches and advisors to walk us through this.
And that's one
It,
of the great things about having a
yeah.
university kind of at your disposal to be able to
Hmm.
use the resources available. So, I work with people from all ages and stages. And if I'm working with someone in a university setting, I ask them if they've gone to their career center. And
Hmm.
usually the answer is no, because they don't know that they even have that resource available to them. But it's great for mock interviewing, getting your resume reviewed, job search techniques, and then they can also do, a interview where they record it and then give you the
Mhm.
recording so that you can watch yourself back again and make any critiques that way, so that you notice how you're speaking, how many ums you're saying, how many, awkward pauses you might have, what your body language looks like. So career centers at universities are great resources that are typically underutilized.
Mhm. I would agree with that actually. And to battle that situation this semester, I have organized a series of career readiness workshops for the students, and we have resume and cover letter, we have interviewing skills, we have internship search and application process, as well as the last one is the job search, because we have students at different stages of their academic path. And I will tell you, exactly what you mentioned. First, they didn't even know we have career center or internship counselors that are happy to help you and guide you through the process. And it's just important to me as an advisor in my roles and with this podcast to bring awareness that you are already sort of paying for these resources with your fees. Go and utilize them. They're so helpful.
Yes, and the same thing, there's workforce centers, which are associated with the counties, at least here in Colorado. I'm not sure about other states if it's set up the same way, but Jefferson County Workforce Center is available for people who are struggling with careers of some sort and may not have access to a career center through a university.
Mm.
So those sorts of resources also exist that a lot of people aren't aware of. And it's just finding out about them and then being able to take advantage of it.
Absolutely. Well, when it comes to virtual interviewing, do you feel like we're ever going back to in person?
I do. And I think that it might be a slow transition. And I think that maybe we'll transition away from phone interviews and to virtual interviews for that phase. And I definitely think for very high level positions, we will be going to back to in person, just because there
Mhm.
are some things that virtual interviews just cannot make up when it comes to those in person interviews. And I think shadowing at a job that you're considering is also a very important technique to consider, because it gives
Mhm.
you an opportunity to not only meet the people that you could potentially be working with if it's going to be an in-person job. It also gives you an opportunity to see the organization, get a feel
Mhm.
for the culture. So I think that if you're going to be interviewing for a job that will be an in-person job, those interviews will likely be in person, at
Yeah.
least towards the end if it's a multi-phase process.
Mhm. Mhm. It's just difficult for me to imagine that I would be going through an interview process for this with this organization or company, and never actually being there and seeing all the folks and how things are set up. And
Yeah.
this year, people had to do that, make that, I want to say brave sort of step to start new jobs remotely without even
Yeah.
seeing ever their teams on site. And I bet that's pretty challenging.
It is. Well, and it really does give you a good feel about if you're going to be a good fit for the organization and if the organization is going to be a good fit for you. So if
Hmm.
you don't have the ability to truly assess what that is, it feels scary because you feel like you might not have all of the information available to make that really informed decision about this major next step.
Hmm. Absolutely. Are there any other things that you would like to mention regarding virtual versus in-person interview process? And I feel like sometimes there's just sometimes things, if I don't know something, I don't know that I don't know that, so I'm just making sure we are covering all of the little things.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of similarities between in person and virtual interviewing.
Hmm.
So I think the biggest difference between virtual and in person is that logistical preparation on the interviewee's side. So making sure you have that technology, making sure that you don't have those interruptions or distractions. But from a similarities perspective, it's also easy to forget some of those basic interviewing techniques. So I think away from techniques and more just basic interview skills, dress up. So if I'm going to be having a virtual interview, I probably don't want to be, in a tank top and shorts. I probably want to dress for the part. And I actually had a conversation with an HR director on the East Coast who said that she was in a virtual interview, and the person they were interviewing was wearing a blazer and looked really nice on top, and then had some technical difficulties and needed to switch devices and shut his computer screen, but it froze. And he wasn't wearing any pants, he was just wearing his boxer briefs. So dress the part fully, just in case there are any issues. If you need to stand up and go do something, the last thing you want is your pajama bottoms or your boxer shorts showing.
I should
And
share this story with my husband.
yes, it would be mortifying. And I don't know if that interviewee knew, but I do know that everyone on the interview, which was about 15 people, had his
Hmm.
frozen screen for several minutes on their screen. So, although he may not have known, that definitely impacted how they felt about him as a candidate because it came down to that critical thinking. If you
Yeah.
aren't thinking about the impact that could potentially have, then do we really want you on our team if that's something that you could miss?
Hmm.
So dress the part fully, top and
Hmm.
bottom. Also, prepare your interview question answers. So, go through those basic behavioral interview questions, come up with your responses using the STAR or the CAR technique, which is basically being able to describe the situation or context, the action that you took, and then the results that action,
Hmm.
resulted in. Don't ramble too much. I've been in several interviews that are virtual where someone will talk for 5 to 7 minutes, and that's a long time on a video. Where the interview panel is just, sitting there quietly, kind of waiting for the
Hmm.
candidate to wrap up their answer. So try to keep your answers short and sweet, no more than 2 minutes per answer. So when it comes to that in person, you can usually read the room. You can
Hmm.
usually tell when people are losing interest, when they're not, you know, paying as much attention to what you're saying, and then you can wrap it up. But with video, you don't have that same feeling because it's just you in this room by yourself. So basic interview preparation is still the same for virtual and in person.
Hmm. So when you are doing your virtual interviews these days, do you all turn on your cameras, the interviewees? So you have okay, so you have one person in the room, obviously the interviewee, and then you have the committee, and you all turn on your camera so you're kind of present and everything. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
And it can be quite distracting if someone turns off their video and then turns it on because it shuffles the way that the view looks. So I recommend if you're not going to have your video on for any part of the interview, from an interviewer perspective,
Yeah.
let the candidate know so that
Hmm.
up front they're not surprised if anything weird happens. But I do recommend having your video on just because that makes it a more in person like experience than having a blank screen.
Yeah.
Even though you might be looking at the Brady Bunch, it's way more interactive to see each of the person's faces and how engaged or disengaged they might be so that you can gauge how you respond to those questions and if you're maybe talking too long.
Hmm. And same goes for the search committee. I think there's no excuse for them not to turn on the camera because I feel like it's the same for the person who's going through the interview. They would like to get to know the people, and it almost sends this bad vibe if somebody's not turning on their camera. Like, are they not interested in me as a person, as a candidate?
Yeah.
Do they even care about this, you know, whole position or process? So I think it goes both ways for sure.
Yes. And if for some reason, as the interviewee or the candidate, if I don't have access to a camera or my
Hmm.
camera is failing, I would want to let them know ahead of time rather than just show up and not say anything about it and have a blank screen. So we, as interviewees and candidates, have to be extra communicative to let everyone know what's going on so that it doesn't seem like we're not committed to the process either.
And to go back to your earlier point with rambling, I think that can happen very easily, especially if it's your first or second interview and you're still very nervous. And sometimes the
Yeah.
nervous makes you just talk and talk and talk. But in reality, you have to stop for them to proceed and continue with their next question. So I
Yes.
was in that boat earlier when I was just starting this whole professional journey. I guess sometimes nerves just overcome me. But I think I learned by going to mock interviews and having that feedback that I need to be confident that I said enough and wrap it up. So
Yes.
I really like that approach that you earlier mentioned about the star, I believe. Yes,
Yes.
star
Yes.
approach.
And STAR is that situation, task, action, and result. And a
Ex-
shortened version of that is CAR, which is just context, which kind of combines situation and task, and then action and result. And so if you can
Excellent.
prepare ahead of time, some examples on, I actually have on my website a free list of 52 behavioral based interview questions.
Hmm.
So if anyone's interested, head over that way.
Yeah.
Um, but you can go through that list of interview questions and prepare your answers based on those. And the chances of you being asked a question that's either identical or similar to one of those is relatively high. And if you already have something pre prepared, then you don't have to feel like you have to think on your feet and ramble if you weren't prepared.
Hmm.
So, another actual technique that I use a lot is there's a pressure point right here between your pointer finger and your thumb. And so if you're feeling nervous and you're feeling like you need to calm down a little bit, you can just with your hands in your lap, put pressure right on that little point, keep it in your lap, and it will actually help calm you down a little bit from like an acupuncture perspective.
That's that's good to know. And also I feel like for me personally, breathing helps.
Yes.
Like,
And reminding yourself to breathe.
yes, sometimes it could be tough.
Yes. And maybe on your little sticky note that you have next to your camera that says, look here, you also have that breathe reminder.
Yes. Good idea. Maybe I should do that for my podcast interviews because I'm still new to this process and it's sometimes I get a little nervous or, so it's very natural for us to be nervous when it's something new and you're very kind of feeling that it's an important event or interview or podcast or YouTube, you're making a video, whatever that is, right? We have to help ourselves in any way we can with little reminders and things like that. That's great.
Yes. And it's a lot easier to help yourself with those little reminders virtually because you're the only person who can see those. The only
Mhm.
thing that the interview team can see is what's coming through that camera. And I might have a million sticky notes on my computer right now, and you would never know
Yeah.
because I'm the only one here.
I'm curious, how this whole virtual interviewing will impact our engineering students who usually have to go through some sort of technical questions portion of it, because typically they would have a whiteboard and they would be presented with a problem and they would have to write things down. So that's something that I haven't heard any feedback about. So I'm curious
Yes.
to find out. Maybe I'll have a couple of students going through this technical kind of interview process this semester and we'll see what they say. But overall, I just feel like so many things are changing and all we can do is prepare ourselves, adjust, because it's not necessarily going to go back to very like normal soon. So,
Yes. Well, and for those sorts of very technical related jobs where you may have to code something or you may have
mhm,
to use a whiteboard to write down an equation and show how you got from, A to B, then I think that our employers will probably send you information on what you might need to be prepared for that. They I and this has probably happened, but probably not very often. I think employers aren't just going to blindside you and be like, all right, we've got a Zoom whiteboard and we want you to type all of these things. I think they'll probably prepare the candidates for whatever they might need or be,
mhm,
ready to do ahead of time. But there are a lot of different platforms out there when it comes to video interviewing that have different aspects. So, like example with Zoom, maybe they would say, okay, so now we're going to move into the technical part where we're going to ask you to solve a couple of problems. We're going to use the whiteboard function. If you want to pull it up and share your screen with us, then you will
Mhm.
type and use the whiteboard, and we'll just be able to see your thought process.
Mhm.
So I imagine that in those sorts of situations that the employer who's conducting the actual interview will prepare people ahead of time for those sorts of, I guess, situations.
Mhm. And speaking of providing questions before the interview, do you feel like it's becoming a more normal thing to do? Because I feel like we want to see the candidate in their best light. What's the point of us stressing them out? And I feel like, my husband actually had a couple of interviews where they would give him questions 15 to 20 minutes before the process started once he arrived on site.
Mhm.
And now you mentioned with virtual, they would share the questions possibly ahead of time. From your professional perspective, what do you feel like is a better approach? Still, no questions, let's just see how you go? Or do you feel like it's better to provide questions?
I think it probably depends on the type of interview that's going to be
Mhm.
occurring. If it's more of a get to know you interview, get a feel for who you are and what type of culture you're going to bring to our organization, and for you to get to know us and our culture with our organization, then I think it will be less structured and probably not sending interview questions ahead of time. However, if we move further in the process and we're getting to be more technical, or we have very specific things that we're asking every single candidate, then it would be appropriate to share questions ahead of time. So
Mhm.
it depends, which is always my least favorite answer to receive because it's still very vague and
Yeah.
ambiguous. Ambiguous, there we go. But it is, I think, very dependent on the position and the organization.
Mhm. And it's important to also remember to always have some questions prepared for the end of the interview. And I remember you just recently released a video on that topic, which I always enjoy watching your videos. I learn something new every time. Can you remind us about those types of questions?
Yes. So in my video, I talk about three different types of questions that you should always ask at the end of an interview. And so some people never have questions prepared. And that actually,
Mhm.
from the interviewer perspective, is a check mark against you because it's showing
Mhm.
that you may not be as invested or did as much preparation as someone else that you're interviewing. So always have questions prepared. And there are a couple of different questions that you can ask. I usually recommend starting off with one that's more personable to the other people on the other side of the screen. So asking them, what do you like best about working here? What is, where do you see this organization going in the next 5 years? So that they can do some talking. And there's actually been some research out there. I can't quote the exact place where I found this, but when interviewers do more talking, they actually feel better about how the interview has gone as a whole than if they do less talking. So, using those questions at the end to get them talking about themselves, what they like about working here, what they like about the organization, what a typical day in their job might look like, that can actually benefit you in the long run in the interview process. There are
Mhm.
some other questions that I recommend asking, but the big one that is usually the most intimidating is asking the interviewers, is there anything that you have questions about or hesitations about me based off of this interview? It's really scary
Mhm.
because they're going to give you feedback of some sort, but it also shows the interviewers that you're open to feedback and that you're willing to receive that feedback. And then hopefully that gives you a chance to either not necessarily defend yourself, but explain why that shouldn't be a concern or how you're going to fill in those gaps.
Got it. Yeah, the last one is interesting. For me personally, working in higher education, I feel like that type of question wouldn't yield a genuine answer just because of the fear to touch on something that could cause some issues in the human resources office. So I want to be like honest with you here and say I don't even know if somebody were to ask me this question, how I would answer that because of what would HR say. So I don't
Yes.
know.
Yes, and it's a big question on both sides for the interviewer to be brave enough and courageous enough to ask it, and then also
Yeah.
for the interviewer on the other side to be brave enough and courageous enough to answer it. So it really depends. You don't want to, as an interviewer, respond from a like very personal perspective. If I say, well,
Yeah.
we just don't think you're going to be a good culture fit, that
Hmm.
is their personal bias probably getting in the way. But
Yeah.
if you are saying, okay, we're interviewing, let's say we have a supervisor position, and I've
Hmm.
interviewed someone who has 3 months of supervisory experience, and this position really does require up to a year of previous supervisory experience. So if
Hmm.
I, as an interviewer, can use very tangible evidence and say,
Got it.
your experience or lack of experience with supervision is something that is a red flag for us or something that we're a little concerned about because maybe you're going to be coming in and managing a very difficult team. And if you're going to be
Yeah.
managing a very difficult team and you don't have a lot of supervisory experience, that might be a significant challenge for you. And we as an organization could be potentially setting you up for failure if we don't feel you're ready to manage that type of difficult team. So from an interviewer perspective, when you're asked that question, hopefully you can answer it with very
Hmm.
tangible evidence as
Tangible.
related to the position, not to the person.
Got it. That makes total sense. And
Yep.
I think I would see more of that feedback and honest answer. I don't know why, but I feel like it would be more in business world and private sector versus in academia for some reason, but maybe that's just my bias. I don't know.
When I think from a cultural perspective, the American workforce is either on one end of the spectrum, the really harsh direct feedback or no feedback and passive aggressiveness. So we have
Hmm.
to really intentionally work to kind of set that culture change from the beginning, which really starts at the interview process. So if we have someone who's willing and open to hear feedback and has requested it, we should be willing and open to give them beneficial,
Yeah.
tangible feedback as well.
Recently, I heard a story on Instagram. A lady was asking for some recommendations and advice because she's been declined the job a few times and she feels like every time she has all the qualifications, she goes to the final round, but she couldn't just make that final impression or something. So she would always ask, could you please provide me with some feedback? I would really love to know why you made this decision. And the answer was, well, we don't think you would be a good cultural fit. And I heard this story. I was like, wow, this is a lawsuit in the US. I don't know. This is where I went immediately. And then
Yeah,
come to find out this story happened in France.
interesting.
So I'm just thinking cultural differences, right? Something maybe that is more appropriate there is not appropriate here. Just like in Germany, I know my cousin who lives there, she applies for jobs every single time. She has to have her photo on her resume.
Yes. And we
So
would
it's just,
never do that here. We would recommend do
no.
not do your photo unless you're a model in real
Yeah.
estate or there's some other reason why you might need your photo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And recently, I was helping a student work on their resume a little bit, just getting their opinion and perspective. And they usually actually use the template from the internet that has a photo. And then I was like, wow, I see a lot of these websites with templates with the picture, their headshot there. I wanted to ask if it's a new trend. I was like, wow, the rules are changing quite quickly. Maybe we are behind or something. I don't know.
Well, and I know that including your photo on a resume is very hit or miss. I always recommend against it just because it sets you up for one more opportunity for discrimination, whether
Mhm.
it's intentional or unintentional. So, I'm sure you've heard of that research study where they took
Mhm.
the exact same resume and they just changed the first name that was displayed on it. So, even
Mhm.
without your picture, there's discrimination that's occurring
Yeah.
unintentionally based off of
Mhm.
your name or based off of locations where you've worked. So, there are things that are at play that we don't have any control over.
Yeah.
So, the things that we do have control over, having our photos on our resumes, we should probably be more intentional about why we're doing that. What is the
Mhm,
benefit of including our
mhm.
photo? And think through that critically before we include it on an application.
Yeah. And I do see quite often these days folks are including their LinkedIn
Yep.
link, right?
Yep.
So that takes you to the profile, and that one has a photo. So eventually, if people really want, they will get to see you, I
Exactly.
suppose, right?
Yep. And on my resume, I include my LinkedIn URL. And
Mhm,
I figure that in this day and age, the chances of a potential employer Googling me is pretty high. And I know that my LinkedIn is going to be one of the first things that's available. So I also know that my LinkedIn profile is more of like my master resume. So it's got my entire background on it, it's got the depth and breadth of my experience. I include all of my previous personal, or excuse me, professional experience because I want people who I'm working with as clients to be able to see that growth and
mhm.
be comfortable with sharing that as well. However, if you submit a resume for an application, it should be 1 to 2 pages. So there's lots of information that could potentially be missing from your resume that you submit to an application of, whatever sort, because you're tailoring it specifically to that job. So if someone wants
Right,
to know a little bit more about you, they Google you, they find your LinkedIn profile, they should not only see the same information that you had on your resume, but also a lot more so that they can get to know you on a more personal level, even though it's all through the internet.
right. I feel like LinkedIn in itself is worth another episode. It's just such
Yeah,
a big topic.
it is.
But
And it's underused. And
yeah,
it's actually saturated with recruiters and employers and undersaturated with potential job applicants. So I agree. Let's do another podcast on LinkedIn.
I think so because honestly, it's a kind of a newer tool, and students, young professionals are not really familiar with that. And sometimes I'll see I like fishing in the about page
Mhm.
on top of their skills and everything. I'm like, I don't know. Do you need to include that on LinkedIn? Maybe not, unless you're trying to get into a fishing business.
Right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah,
Include what's relevant for your professional trajectory.
yeah. Well, I think this is really a great conversation and great information. Abby, I really want to thank you for finding the time to talk to me about this. And I really hope that students will find value in this information. Can you remind us one more time, how can we find you on YouTube and what's your website again?
Yes. So my name is Abigail Hoeh. I kind of go by that professionally, but my nickname is Abby. So pretty much everyone calls me that, and I introduce myself that way. So you can find me on YouTube by searching the YouTube channels Life Work Balance. And I like to, point out that it's life comes before work, which is why I've titled it Life Work Balance rather than Work Life Balance. And then my website is lwbalance.com. So if you're
Excellent.
interested in getting to know me a little bit more, I have, about me section if you're interested in working with me from a coaching or consulting perspective. I've also got a lot of free resources and a blog on my website, so feel free to visit that and let me know if you have any feedback.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Abby, and we'll see you next time. Hopefully, we'll do this on somewhat reoccurring basis. Who knows?
Yes, that would be great. Thank you so much for having me, Natalie.